Welcome to The Book Podcast, where we discuss books about the book, the Bible, with your hosts, Scott Moffitt, Gabriel Penfield, and Gary Karwoski.
We go as deep as we can go, look as hard as we can look, but we only scratch the surface of the meaning of the book. We only scratch the surface of the meaning of the book.
Welcome to the 30th podcast of the book. Our goal is to interview authors about the book that they have written. Today we speak with Dr. Craig Glickman, who is an author, conference speaker, seminary professor, and lawyer. Dr. Glickman, your name was suggested to me by a good friend of yours, Brad Che. He said that I should invite you to share about your book, which concerns the Song of Solomon. I found it quite ironic since we had just interviewed Fred about his book on the topic of suffering.
Yep.
And your book is about marriage. And I was wondering, are these two books interrelated and linked somehow? Anyway, I find it interesting that the preaching on the Song of Solomon is almost akin to touching the third rail for exegetes. There's a perceived danger in preaching on this book. Craig, we welcome you to our podcast. I'm your host, Scott Moffitt, and today I am joined by my fellow podcasters, Gary Karwoski, retired pastor, and current student at Word of Life and graduate of Liberty, Gabe Penfield, my grandson.
Oh, nice.
Interesting. This is the second of two books that Dr. Glickman has written on the Song of Solomon. I have both of them.
Yep. I do too.
The first was A Song for Lovers. And the second, which is the book that we're reviewing today, is Solomon's Song of Love. I bought your first book back before I ever even thought about attending seminary. And then I bought your book most recently in order to facilitate this podcast. So after 23 years, you wrote a second book about the same book that you wrote about at first. Why did you write the second book, Solomon's Song of Songs? What prompted you to rewrite it?
Well, the Song of Solomon was always of great interest to me. I'd written my master's thesis on it when I was a student at Dallas Seminary, just on the literary structure, which I felt like was the key to understanding the meaning of it. And then I wrote A Song for Lovers when I was a student. It was published right after I graduated, but I wrote it I think my senior year at DTS. And it became popular because it recognized that there was an authentic relationship of some, whether idealized in a song but it was a relationship about a man and a woman, not something that was only spiritual and only about God's relationship to Israel or to the church. And so the book got some notoriety, but I'd only been studying Hebrew, I think, for 2 to 3 years at that point. And I still had 12 years of teaching and 3 years of doctoral work in Switzerland ahead of me, and a lot of contemplation on some of the thorny problems with that book. And so finally, about 23 years later, I felt like I had solved some of the problems that had puzzled me when I'd first written about it when I was 25 years old. And so I thought, I'm a little bit of a perfectionist. So I thought I really need to get this right and fine tune the literary structure and some of the meaning, some of the grammatical problems. You as scholars, all of you are biblical scholars, you appreciate how tedious a work it is to go ahead and chase back a grammatical problem that goes back to a mistake that Gesenius made centuries before and correct that. Very tedious work. Probably a little bit like working on a Swiss watch, but it was important to me to try to get it as precise as possible, and it was a delight too. I enjoyed it, but so that's why I wrote the second book. I also wrote a third commentary on it, which you might call it that. I also did the commentary on the Song of Solomon in the Christian Study Bible, formerly the Holman Christian Standard Bible. And so I wrote that. And each time I wrote on that, I feel like I understood a little bit more about it, and was really just scratching the surface on getting control of the book. Very beautiful book, but very, very difficult.
Yeah.
And it's to understand it precisely. But what I've discovered is the more I delve into it, the more amazing it becomes. And actually, the third book, in the Christian Standard Bible, was the first time I had to write any kind of an introduction that would be customary to a commentary, where you deal customarily with questions of date and authorship. So I got to dive into that a little bit more, and I found that fascinating to, see the twists and turns that have taken place in scholarship. If it's not going into too much depth, I'll tell you a story about the difficulty of the song. I don't know if you've ever heard of Ernst Jenny, Jenni, but he would be the foremost, of the last generation, the foremost Old Testament scholar in Europe. And he was my Old Testament professor at the University of Basel when I got my doctorate there. And a wonderful man, just very godly man. We had great time together. But in any case, he wrote what the Jenny Westermann, you've heard Klaus Westermann's work on Psalms and so forth, but he and Westermann put together the theological word book. The Old Testament's kind of a standard. It's like Daniel Webster would be known here, but he was an amazing scholar. Well, when I wrote this second book, Solomon's Song of Love, I passed it around to 4 or 5 people, Eugene Merrill and, various folks who would be Old Testament scholars, and asked them if they would be willing to write some kind of comment on it. What do you think about this? Would you advise people to read this, or what problems do you have with it, and so forth? So I sent it to Dr. Jenny, and I asked him if he would be willing to write a little blurb like we do here in America on a book. And he sent me back a very lengthy response in German. We all spoke German together, all the classes, were in German, but it was nice to, hear the language and his response again. And he wrote back a lengthy response, essentially saying that he's never made the Song of Solomon an area of study in his professional life, so he would be unqualified to make any comments about my book. And that's when I realized that maybe I shouldn't be writing a book about it either. Here it is, one of the foremost Old Testament scholars in the world. He just didn't want to make any comments about it because he felt like he had never given it the attention, it deserves. And so it was a sobering moment to get his letter in the mail.
The third rail.
It's a difficult book. It's a difficult song, but it's also beautiful and worth all the effort to get into it.
Well, there's a lot of Hebrew hapaxes on it that you don't see those words anywhere else.
That's right.
So that contributes to the issue. Let's talk about who wrote the Song of Solomon.
Solomon wrote the Song of Solomon.
There you go.
Yeah.
It's the only book that doesn't mention the name, or one of the only 3 books in the Bible that doesn't mention the name of God.
People say that, but I think that's not true.
That's not true?
In chapter 8, it says, it refers to the flame as the flame of Yah. And it's an abbreviation of the flame of Yahweh.
Sure.
Probably an allusion to Deuteronomy 4. But that's a common thing. You always hear that. But no, I think that you can say God is mentioned. And God is present. You can say, not only is his name mentioned in chapter 8, but in what is in the chiastic arrangement of the structure, the wedding night, after this crescendo of the wedding night, chapter 5, verse 1, 2, so forth, somebody speaks, eat, O friends, and drink deeply, O lovers. And the only really guest that you can imagine would be there to congratulate the lovers on their wedding night would be God himself.
Yeah.
But his voice speaks and his name is there.
Yeah. In this second book, you actually begin with the wedding night.
That's right.
In the center, and then you go back and fill in the details later. Why did you decide to make that approach?
Well, I think that's sort of that's the climax of the book. I mean, the crescendo, the most beautiful section of the book there is the wedding night. And I thought, just from a psychological standpoint, it would be nice to begin with what the ultimate goal is, so that there's a heightened desire to understand what kind of courtship would lead up to this, and then what kind of marriage would follow it. It was just a way to present it,
Yeah.
I read both books, preparing for this podcast. And I almost had the feeling that two different men wrote these books.
Mhm.
I that's said tongue in cheek, but there's a different tone and outlook between the two books. My question is, Craig, did you change as a man in those passing 23 years? Did something go on in your life that changed your understanding of the book as you read it the second time? The second book is filled with personal allusions and stories and context for you personally.
Well, of course, I had a lot more experience when I was, S. Lewis Johnson asked me when I was a third year student what I was going to write my master's thesis on. And I told him, well, I was going to write it on the Song of Solomon, on the literary structure of the song. And we always had banter going on with each other. He said, well, that's an unusual topic for a single,
Mhm.
And I said, well, not really. I said, I'm practicing to be a theologian. He was writing a theology at the time, which he never finished. And I said, well, not really. I said, I'm practicing to be a theologian, and theologians often write about that which they haven't experienced.
Hmm.
And he said, often, I would say customarily.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
And so, but the point being that there was, at the time I was a young life leader. It clearly had my audience in mind as being my high school kids, that were, they were new Christians in young life. And so that probably accounts for part of the tone, my inexperience as a young man, and then primarily having a ministry with teenagers probably, explains that tone a little bit more. Whereas you take the Solomon Song of Love, and I was in the middle of raising children. I've been through a very painful divorce at the time, and I was the one left responsible 24/7. We had no help, but for raising three young men.
Yeah.
Two of whom are practicing law with me now. That was that probably accounts for a lot too. I had more experience to draw upon. Also, I think I appreciated my parents more at the time, so I was able to weave them in as, I always have stories at the beginning, middle, and end of a chapter in Solomon's Blood. And the reason those stories are there is to try to have a backdrop, kind of like the frame of a picture, which would either be a comparison or contrast with what the material was. It was just a way of having a framing that information that was in the Song of Solomon. And I found I had rich material I was blessed to have two wonderful parents. They met during World War II. They were both in the service. My dad was a XO of a B-29 bomber squadron on Guam. Married my mother, came back, raised family. They were very well respected, very admired in the community. And I was just very fortunate to see, as I grew older, you appreciate your parents more. You don't appreciate it as much when you're a young person, but I could see what an incredible relationship they had. And it gave me some depth, I think, to put in there in that second book. Of course, my mother had, by the time I wrote that, my mother had just passed away. And so there was a poignancy there that probably made its way into the book. You might remember the story there at the end. My mother came by. I came by to see my father, probably every evening in the first few years after my mother passed away. And but in the first 6 months after she passed away, I was over there, and he was eating some chili. But my dad didn't know how to cook very well. My mother was all the cooking for him. And he was eating this chili that my mother always used to make. And I said, well, Dad, I was just making it like, I said, looks, like you finally learned to cook a little bit. I'm glad you learned how to make this chili that Mother used to make for you all the time. He said, well, he said, I still haven't learned how to make it. Before your mother died, she made, a lot that she put in the freezer.
There you go.
have some, and he was there. He showed me thinking about my mother.
Mhm.
I was blessed to see that relationship.
Yeah.
So anyway, I hope that's not too much explanation for the tone, but I think that different place in life for me, maybe a little bit more academic. I think there's more academic precision, in the second book.
Yeah. Yep. So the difference is audience, a lot of different factors that play there. But
Well, that's true. Yeah.
also the content of the book, you talk a lot about how we need to interpret it literally, just like we need to interpret the Bible literally, right? Depending on context, right? And it also plays into that Song of Solomon's also poetry. But can you explain the dynamic between interpreting Song of Solomon literally versus maybe an analogy? Maybe can you explain that difference and why that difference is important? Is it important? Like, what are your thoughts on that?
Do you go by Gabriel or Gabe?
Yeah, usually Gabe because it's quicker, but either way.
Gabe? No, that's fine. Well, I actually watched it. I saw a little bit of you on some earlier podcasts, and I know that this is important to you on interpretation and hermeneutics, and so it doesn't surprise me you'd be interested in the approach here. And it might come as a doesn't come as too much of a shock. I don't prefer to talk about literal translation. I gave a message on that to the Grace Evangelical Society. I touched on that. I think a lot of times it's just misleading. I know what we all mean, the group of us mean by that. I think we're spot on, of course, but I think that a lot of times when people say they believe in a literal interpretation, they just mean they believe it. They mean, well, I believe it literally. That doesn't address the questions of genre. What kind of genre are we dealing with here? Are we dealing with a parable that doesn't really claim to be historical or factual? Are we dealing with narrative that the narrative in the Gospels or the narrative in Genesis? I think they're the same genre, quite frankly. Which is both tells a story and is also historical. It's like the Word made flesh, and so we have a different kind of genre than we have in. It's not newspaper. It's not reading Toynbee's history, and so I prefer to say that instead of interpreting literally, I think it's a little more accurate to say I want to interpret according to the literary genre. And then the hermeneutic I suggest is not what you read in all the hermeneutics books. I would say the best hermeneutical book to read would be a book on Logic 101 and just read about induction. Because, I was a professor of philosophy too. And so I never got away from the fact that all these other applications of induction, whether it's in science or literature, it's still the same principles of logical induction. So I would, when I talk to students, I say interpret according to the literary genre and according to rigid principles of induction, which is true in science or any other field. So that's a long-winded explanation, but now as that applies to the Song of Solomon, I used to take the point of view that it was literal, that is, it was an actual event between Solomon and Shulamith. I don't believe that anymore. If I had to guess, I would say it's like a song. It's a fictional relationship, but a real human being relationship, just like it would be in a song you might listen to today. You don't necessarily think that a song about love is necessarily between two real people that's being described. It may be an idealized account. And the reason I came to that view is because, a couple of reasons. One, I don't see any place to put it in the life of Solomon. I struggle with that. I tried to do that in a couple of things I wrote. I just presented some various options of where it could go. And I finally decided, he wrote 1,005 songs. I think this was just the best song that he wrote. And it was an idealized picture of what a relationship should be like. And also, another thing that probably influenced me a little bit, over 30 or 35 years, by the way, I think I finally get to the right answer, but I am very slow. I am very slow to make any progress in thinking about this. It took me years to finally, because I'm so deliberate or something. I don't know what problem I've got, but it finally, I think, has solidified where I see the balance here, that the Song of Solomon is about a real relationship, maybe not one actually in history, but about a real human being relationship or an idealized form like a song. But it's also about God's love for Israel and by extension, by God's love for the church, but primarily God's love for Israel when it was originally written. And it took me, I was so keen when I was 25 years old to see the literal relationship between a man and a woman that I missed so many exegetical clues that absolutely showed that this was God's love for Israel as being enacted. It's just, it took me forever to come to that. Well, finally, I was able to express that in the foreword to my commentary and what is it, the Christian Standard Study Bible.
Now, is that by application or by interpretation?
By interpretation.
Okay.
Absolutely by interpretation. That's a great question. No, by interpretation. She's compared. Well, I'll tell you an amazing thing. It comes out, it's in the book, I think. I think it's maybe an appendix of Solomon's Song of Love. I know it's in the notes and the old, but
a modern translation.
Anyway, she's compared to the Shulamith is compared to Israel. She's compared to she's compared to 4 women. Actually, there's allusions to 4 different women, in the Song of Solomon, which are very artfully, very delicately done. Maybe the analogy of a Swiss watch comes back to mind, but she's compared to Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, and Bathsheba. Where do we see those people again? It's incredible. I remember when I saw that, when I got to the 4th person, I can't remember which was the 4th, when I was working on this again, a few years ago, that I was just astonished. I couldn't believe that, here in the Song of Solomon, as this theology began to develop, the theology of reconciliation with Israel and all that you would even have the 4 women who appear in the genealogy of Matthew. It was just astonishing to me.
Can I ask you a question about that?
Of course, yeah.
That's not stated bluntly in the book. It doesn't say Tamar or one of the other ladies' names. Right. So it's, do you believe someone that's not trained in theology and exegesis could get that from reading through Solomon's song?
Well, I don't know. It depends how accurate the translation was. You have clear allusion to Tamar with why should she have, and both in substance is there.
It's more by allusion, isn't it, than direct?
Well, except for Bathsheba.
Yeah, except for the mother.
There she was in labor and gave you birth. Yes. So there's a direct relationship. Yeah. And the one with Ruth is pretty crystal clear. You've got Ruth in 2 different places. Particularly how they met in the field and so forth, and then even as she was laboring in the sun.
Right.
And so that's pretty clear. And then the reference to the scarlet rope, the scarlet thread,
right?
That's pretty direct. And then the veil there's not a lot of literature. They didn't have the number of books you have behind you there. They had almost like cultic literature. And so the reference to why should I be a veil? Why should I have to hide like she had to hide? The substance fits there too. So yeah, I think no, I don't know how many people would pick that up. I don't know how many people would pick up the alliteration. I memorized it in the Hebrew when I first started working on it a few years ago, because there was so much alliteration in there and I try to put that into the book, in the notes especially, and it becomes sort of the key to interpreting a lot of things too. We see this it's beautiful alliteration in the original Hebrew.
Yeah, it's hard to see that unless you got the original.
Yeah, it's true.
I think you've already answered this question by saying that this is one of Solomon's songs that presents the ideal. But I guess my thinking on this as I'm reading through this is like, how does this fit into Solomon's life? He had 700 wives and 300 concubines. How does that comport with the Song of Solomon actually comport with his actual lifestyle? It seems to be, I don't know, maybe hypocritical.
It didn't.
That's the beauty of it, really.
Yeah.
The beauty of it is that God all often, if not customarily, does that. The apostle of grace was the greatest legalist. No one was more legalistic than the apostle Paul, but God chooses Paul to take the message of grace. No one was against unjust suffering more than Peter. No, you're not going to suffer. But then he writes it as, his epistle is the theme of it's unjust suffering.
Yeah.
No one wanted to call down thunder and lightning more than John. He becomes the apostle of love. And I think there's several reasons why God would do that. But I think it shows his grace, but also shows the message is coming from him. It's not coming from a natural source. When God speaks this message of love through Solomon, you recognize the voice of God. When the message of grace comes through Paul, when the lesson of unjust suffering comes through Peter, or love comes from John, it comes from a place where because God's transformed that person and provided his message. So to me, that's the beautiful part, is that it comes from somebody and of course, then there's a message of grace to people who feel like they've been partly like Solomon, I suppose, or partly like Paul. And that there's, just because you've been a legalist doesn't mean that you can't be an apostle of grace, or just because you've been an angry person doesn't mean you can't be a person of love. And just because you abuse sexual whatever, that you can't be somebody to find real love and the proper place of sex in a relationship, things like that. So
the Song of Solomon is presenting the ideal relationship between a man and a woman. It kind of reminds me of the ideal wife that's presented in, where is it at?
Proverbs 30.
Proverbs 31, I think it is.
Yes.
Every time I preached on that on a Mother's Day, you get
Mhm.
backlash from the ladies. You know, is that kind of the same thing going? The ideal is being presented for us to live up to, but because we're flawed, failed sinners, we can never do that.
Oh, I don't know.
I mean, I'm hoping that's true in my
Well-
relationship with my wife.
I don't really think it's about the ideal relationship. I think if we're really going to put a microscope on the Song of Solomon, we don't see anything about how do you manage finances together. We don't see anything
That's
about how you
true.
raise children together.
Yeah.
Who's
yeah,
going
yeah.
to take care of the golden retriever you just bought? You know, we don't see a lot of things. You know, what you really see, what you see is kind of like the Impressionists. Let me back off. The Impressionists figured out a way. The genius of the Impressionists was they figured out a way to extract beauty from the most ordinary scenes. And they figured out a technique to do that. The technique later got perverted. But the Impressionists, that was their genius. They could take the most ordinary thing and they could, like a perfumer, probably, what do you call it, a perfumer or something,
Mhm.
like the person who can extract just the fragrant scents from a number of things, flowers, and create a wonderful scent. They figured out how to extract beauty from any scene. So that you look at their paintings of ordinary scenes, but it was beautiful. And what is taking place in the Song of Solomon, they have extracted the romantic love aspect and put that, you know, front and center. And so you see just the heart. What is the key? What is the poem? And now I see with eyes serene the very pulse of the machine. Yeah, it's the word for the poem. But they saw the essence of this romantic love, which is really at the core of the relationship within the Trinity. And they were able to put that front and center from start to finish. So that it begins and ends with that. It begins like falling in love. There's no buildup. Oh, may kiss me with the kiss of his mouth. And it concludes that there's still this excitement. So there's getting at the core of what that romantic love is. It doesn't cover the whole relationship. There are all the practical things. There are all the self-help books. But it is trying to draw attention to the most beautiful part, like the Impressionists did. You know.
Interesting. Mhm.
Yeah. So so here's a question. I'm not married. I'm 20. Go looking for somebody. Say somebody's looking for a wife, looking for somebody to either date or court or look at a relationship in the future. What's the balance? Because Song of Solomon's a lot about sexual attraction. Should that be the main goal? Obviously not. What's the best way to, I guess, is there too much weight given to sexual attraction in the culture today? How can that be avoided or dealt with in a positive way? Like, I guess, what's the balance between looking for a godly woman versus sexual attraction versus all the different balances and all of that? Like, what's your advice there? And how can we learn through Song of Solomon how to balance that?
Well, I don't have any advice from myself about that, but I can tell you what the Song of Solomon says about that. That it
Mhm.
seems there is a great appreciation for character throughout. If you read through it again, you'll see that a number of the praises he has are praising her character.
Mhm.
Throughout the praise of chapter 4 on the wedding night, like a mare among the chariots of Pharaoh, she's very attractive, but very respectful, you know. But again, I'd say chapter 4, even chapter 7, where you have more praise, you always get praise of character through there. And another thing you see in there, you see that. Well, here's my advice to you. If I were going to give any advice from the Song of Solomon, is you want to find your feminine counterpart. You want to find a feminine version of yourself, because they're portrayed as the masculine and feminine versions of the same character. You know,
Yes.
Solomon comes from the word shalom, shulamo, and shulamith is just the feminine version of the same word. That's why
That was really interesting.
I'm sorry.
Yes.
Shulama. The masculine and feminine version of the same person. And so that's really what you're looking for. You're not looking for, you know, the best person or the most sexy person and all that. You want to find somebody that is your companion. And so like who you are. This is a little bit of self-help type stuff, but become the kind of person you want to be, and then try to find somebody that's the feminine version of yourself.
Mm.
But that's just what I see in the song. That is, I'm not
Yeah.
saying it's because I'm a psychologist, but you see that sort of thing going on there, you know.
Yep. That's good. That's good. That's good.
Yeah. Then y'all recognize each other. See, I think I've always known you. You know, I think I've always known you. You know?
I think we sometimes call it a soulmate.
Mm.
Yeah, well, that's not a bad term. It's overworked maybe sometimes, but it's really sort of what the idea, you know, in the Song of Solomon, there were soulmates.
So is there the right does each person have a right person?
Well, that's a question on sovereignty and free will and all that. And, you know, has all the complexities and mystery of any kind of question like that. His only job for you is their only part of it. You know, but
In the first edition, you had an appendix in which you gave a modern translation of the song. That was the title of it.
right.
I found that to be very helpful in clarifying some of my thinking
Hmm.
about the translation. I wondered why you didn't include it in the second book.
Well, I think I just had a very accurate literal translation, or what the best translation would be on the second book, didn't I? I think I did do my own translation in the second.
Right. You did.
And
but-
you know, I did the translation. By the way, I was the translator. I was one of the translators in the Christian Standard Bible for their talk. They didn't take all my suggestions. You know, it was a committee. We couldn't say
Oh,
you can't
no.
get all your points in. There's no way to get all my points in. But yeah, I worked on translation a lot, and I think I just I don't know why I didn't put that in there. I think I felt like it's more helpful just to the most accurate translation. I think is what I settled for finally on that second book.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Gary?
Well, yeah, I
He's
think
speechless.
yeah, I am. Let's go to one aspect of the song, because we want to introduce our listeners to this.
Sure.
The foxes that come into a marriage is demonstrated in the song. What are those, and what do you do about those?
Well, you need to ask me about the poetry of the song. I'm not very good on practical advice. Well, I think the most important thing, the only thing I can tell you is that I've always interpreted the foxes there in chapter 2 as being things that can upset the courtship. And so I think the most obvious application of that, you know, let's catch the foxes, little foxes that destroy vineyards. Well, their vineyards are in blossom. And so you just want to be cautious. That's all. I mean, you want to be careful. You want to be godly. You want to be Christ-like as much as you can in your courtship. That's all. I mean, I think now what those foxes might be, we can all speculate, you know, but you certainly don't want to get ahead of yourself sexually, and you want to treat each other with respect. You don't want to develop bad patterns of how you relate or how you settle conflict, and you know, all those kind of things. But I think anybody's advice on that would be as good or better than mine. I mean, it's just, but I think that's what it's identifying. And as a student of the song, that's where I would come down on what the foxes are.
So they're representative of difficulties that can come into a relationship?
Well, challenges or temptations.
Challenges,
in a relationship.
temptations.
Yeah.
Mhm.
You know, it's always a temptation to take each other for granted. That's what happens there at the wedding night. After the wedding night,
Right.
the next thing is taking a partner for granted, and so they have to work through this conflict. Have you gotten as far as the dance of the Maccanean? You come across that? The dance of the two camps?
Yes.
And
Yes.
that's at the end of that's the lengthiest section, is the conflict resolution section after the
Right.
wedding night. And at the end of it, there's so much rich stuff there, but it says that everybody dances at the dance of the Maccanean. Well, what does that mean? Well, if you really want some amusement, you could always read what the commentaries say about the dance of the Maccanean. There's all kinds of speculation. Well, this must have been some erotic dance. They just totally bring in something that's ridiculous. Or this was an erotic dance, or it was a dance from so-and-so, and they'll take something 500 or 600 years later where they danced at this thing. Totally, if you want to read the most irrelevant literature in the world, read on what the speculations of the dance of the Maccanean are. Because Bible Study 101 would say, look up and see how that word is used, in the rest of the Bible, you might discover what's going on here. Well, okay, it's at the end of a great reconciliation section. It's obviously a little bit contrived. Somebody takes someone for granted. They get together, they reaffirm their love for each other, et cetera, and then they ride off together. Well, where does that originate? Do y'all know where that originates? I'll tell you, just in case you don't recall. Well, that was where Jacob and Esau reconciled. Remember, he was told to diversify his assets in case he lost half, he'd keep the other half. He didn't know if Esau would kill him, and that was it. So it's a little speculative, but what do you think the people did that were in the two camps? When they reconciled, it was the place of reconciliation, the dance of reconciliation. It's obviously it's so simple. I found no commentator that would make the correlation. And the other place that it's used, I think, at the end of the Civil War after David came to power, that was where there was final reconciliation. It was at Machanaim. There's a little verse that says, and it was at Machanaim. It's just so consistent. And so some things are pretty simple, and we make it hard. But anyway.
Yeah. So,
are you familiar with remember the refrain, do not arouse or awaken love until it pleases? It occurs 3 times. Well, it doesn't actually occur 3 times. It's translated like it occurs 3 times. It really only occurs twice. The third time it occurs, it's a different grammatical structure. And what it really means is definitely arouse and awaken love when it's pleased to awaken, when it's time. So in answer to your question, Gabe, when you meet the right person, it's time to go, then really pursue it. Be very cautious, very cautious, very cautious, but it was time to act, be ready to act. And that goes back, by the way, to Gesenius, who made a mistake on the grammar there. But if you look at the underlying Hebrew grammar, that's really clear from other parallel passages, parallel grammatical structure in the song, that's what it means. But anyway, that
Gesenius.
Nobody gets that translation correct. You can't find it anywhere in print. But look up the Hebrew and you'll see.
Yeah.
Anyway.
So what if just a question, not speaking from experience, but what if let's say you're in a marriage and you're not quite feeling what Song of Solomon is like, you're not feeling the sexual attraction that's described in Song of Solomon. Like, what are your thoughts on that? Like, obviously you can't live up to Song of Solomon every time. Very few relationships can live up to the perfect ideal. What happens if you're not living up to that perfect ideal?
Living up, not experiencing it. I mean, no, I don't know if I'll get to live up to it, but well, you have duty. You have a duty there that's beyond any kind of emotional romantic attraction. There's still a duty to be the kind of husband and or wife that you're supposed to be. I mean, I don't think just because there's setbacks there that there's somehow it opens up the door to divorce or anything like that. You get all the help you can. It may not be a good match. It may be that you're going to be miserable, but that's where you are.
That's where your character comes out.
Yeah, well,
who you are as a person.
It's a what do you call it? Well, it's a trial you're going to be going through for a long time, and very many people go through that. I have a good friend who, we lost touch actually for many years, and then got back in touch, and she had actually had a ministry for abstinence. That's they would go into these high schools and talk about the benefits of abstinence of sex before marriage. This is pretty unpopular nowadays, today's culture. And she kind of joked around that one of the benefits of that she was kidding, of course. One of the benefits of the practice of abstinence during courtship was to prepare the people for the customary absence of sex within marriage. I thought, well, that didn't sound very, very optimistic.
Yeah.
She was kidding, but it is a challenge, Gabe. It's that would be a very difficult thing for any couple to go through, and sometimes it happens not because of any lack of attraction, but there can be physical reasons, illness that comes in. There's all kind of interferences, and all the things that anybody's going to tell you, that any Christian is going to say about how you proceed through trials and challenges is going to be applicable there too. We all have to depend upon the Lord and insight and other support. And, like James says, count it all joy when you encounter various tests, because they're going to improve your faith. They're going to improve your faith too.
I read a study once that said the average couple, I don't know if they counted them. I assume that they
Do they
did
tell
some
the
kind of a
truth?
study. They said the average couple has sex more in the first year of marriage than they will the rest of their married life. And, I'd probably say that's probably true
Yeah.
because of all the pressures, the difficulties, the children that you raise, the health issues, those all play a part in it.
Yeah. No, it's a challenge that
Mhm.
All right, Craig, your second book is filled with personal illustrations and illusions,
yeah.
and I think it would be fair to look at a couple of those. I have a
Sure.
couple of favorites actually. And
Okay.
so-
good.
okay. One of my favorites is you were hanging out with the guys and you were talking about what kind of sexual fantasies you have.
Well, you know what? I can look over where I'm situated right now in my office. That is across Highway 75 from Southern Methodist University, where I went to school from SMU.
Yeah.
And if I stepped out about 20 feet, I could see that field where that took place.
Okay, they're very good. And so your comment was, my fantasy is to make love to the woman I love. I thought
Right.
that was tremendous.
Well, it was the best I could come up with at the time, and I think it made sense. These guys were pretty crazy. I mean, they didn't have they didn't have any restraints on a lot of my fraternity brothers. But yeah, to me, that's a pretty ambitious goal. Maybe a lot harder to achieve than theirs if you think about it. Yeah. I'm
No.
sorry. Did you want me to comment anything on that? But no.
No,
Yeah.
that was perfect.
Yeah.
The second one that I really liked was in the girlfriend who revealed to you something, a deep, dark secret from her
Oh, yeah.
past.
Yeah.
And so and when you first bring it up, you kind of reacted negatively to it.
Mhm.
Later on in the book, you kind of reconcile that. But I guess my question from that is, should we really be totally honest about our misadventures, our poor choices of our past to a potential mate?
Well, that very question is asked in a lot of literature, right? How much should you disclose about the past?
Right.
I don't have a good answer on that. So maybe it's a case by case. A lot of times in my practice, it's a case by case. Maybe for some people, it's real important they really need to know or want to know. For other people, it's in the past and there's no sense bringing it back up. But I don't know. Maybe there's a better biblical answer that I can come up.
Well,
What do
in
y'all
that
think? What do y'all
in
think?
that experience, though, it's submarine the relationship. In that illustration, you were
Well, what submarine the relationship was my bad attitude.
right, but
Yeah.
her bringing it up
But
brought that out.
it was my fault, not hers on that.
Yeah, I'm not
I
trying
had a
to.
very immature response to that I'm ashamed of to this day. But
Right.
but so I don't know if that's a good test case to illustrate whether or not
Right.
to bring it up or not. But
In another part of the book, you talk about the art of giving praise,
Hmm.
which seems to be lost today
Yeah.
to your spouse. I grew up with a father that went through the greatest generation, World War II.
mhm.
And we had as our role models, John Wayne, Gary Cooper, and that kind of
Right.
men. How do we learn to give praise and sustain it in our marital relationships? Do you have any advice on that from the song or personally?
No, I don't have any advice other than I think
Bad question.
I don't have advice on it, but I think that what you're bringing up is something that we should all take time to develop. I mean, I've tried to be better about that. My own parents became better at that the longer they
Right.
lived. I try to be better at that myself, and I think it takes a little time, a little bit.
Wasn't that modeled though in the song by the participants?
Yes.
So
Yes. Well, if you wanted to, back to the Song of Solomon,
Mhm.
there was always this constant praise back and forth.
Mhm.
That's right.
I think that's what makes some people uncomfortable because the praise got very specific, about breasts and thighs and that kind of thing, where in actuality, that's probably a really good thing to do with your lover. So,
Mhm.
Who's next? Don't be shy.
All
Yeah,
right,
we can throw the ball to you, man.
yeah.
I'm sorry.
Gabe?
Yep. Gotcha. Gotcha. You give some principles for marriage from the song in chapter 11, right? Going back to Song of Solomon, going back to scripture. You
Yeah.
speak of true love, right? You hear about true love all the way back to Cinderella, all the way up to all the movies nowadays. True
Mhm.
love, right?
Princess
Um,
Bride.
Yeah, Princess Bride, right?
Yeah.
But
Jeez.
I love that movie. Good movie. But it grows through hardships, is what you said in the book in Song of Solomon. It begins with mutual delight. It can journey through pain. It is constant and strong. It is the source of all fire. True love is two priceless gifts: the man giving himself to her, and the woman giving herself to him. Can you elaborate on like the difference between the true love in the culture today and the true love we see in Song of Solomon? I see a pretty big difference, but can you explain maybe, is there differences you see specifically?
No, I have to think about it.
Yeah. Yeah, because true love, I think today is you see somebody and it's love at first sight, right? You lock eyes and it's like, that's the one for me. That's it.
Yeah.
We'll make it. And then it ends up, the fire dies down and, well, we're
That's
done now.
lust.
Yeah. Lust.
Yeah.
Is there such a thing as love at first sight? Do we see that in Song of Solomon?
Oh, I don't know.
Hmm.
Yeah.
That's complex.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, we start talking about that, about all the psychological preconditions that lead to that and whether it's accurate or not. I think it's beyond the scope of what we can cover here, but I think it can be a fairly immediate experience. And that's probably because, and that's just been true throughout several thousand years of history, where people describe Cupid's arrow. Cupid's arrow is instructive in, showing that they're trying to have a myth that describes the experience of romantic love. And it's because it's sudden. You don't seem to be in control of it. It's kind of chosen you, and kind of an overwhelming experience. And that's been true for thousands of years. So, why the human race experiences it that way is, a different question. But it's probably, I think I said a long time ago that it's a lot more risky to fall in love at first sight in today's culture than it was, 75 years ago with their parents, mainly because of the fundamentals of character. And, it's an unpredictable value structure you've got out there, But no, but I don't think I'm dancing around your question. What's the difference between true love now and what it was in the Song of Solomon?
Yeah, what's the difference?
I would say, well, in the song, obviously, you have a deep as deep an appreciation of character as you do physical beauty, and they're perfectly aligned. There's not a conflict between that. It's not a choice between a godly woman and an attractive woman. The person had both. I mean, in their relationship, they were both physically attracted and, character attracted to each other. And then also it was undergirded, as much as all the emotional was, that they also had individual character that sustained it through difficult times, like his patience during her time of ingratitude. And then you finally have the love of God at the basis of any love they had in chapter 8, where his love is compared to God's love when it's a flame of fire, waters cannot quench it, and so forth. It's an allusion to the kind of jealous love, jealous in the good sense that's where it's used in the Bible, that God has. So it's undergirded by that. Whereas today, you're not going to find that many people who have that deep abiding relationship to God, so they're going to evidence that love. And there also seems to be a default position to go just to physical attraction rather than to the character, and so that skews things too. I mean, that you can make those simple observations, I suppose.
Yeah, and
Absolutely.
Yep. And if you're rooted in the Word, most of the time, and there's exceptions, but if you're actually pursuing Christ, you're going to value that character versus just physical attraction.
Well, yeah, the more, like I say, you find a counterpart for yourself, Gabe. I mean, the more Christ-like you become, the more you appreciate him and what he stands for, that you're going to want to find somebody who shares that, And but we don't want to get you young people, I should say but that you don't want to get in the position where it has to be a one or the other. You don't want to have to deny your need to find somebody that's attractive. Solomon did not in the song, nor do you want to minimize the importance of the character.
Yeah,
I remember one seminary student saying that the better looking the woman was, the less she had to believe, you know. And that was not a very good algorithm.
No. All right, let's just briefly get back to the Hebrew aspects of it, even though most of our listeners aren't going to be reading it in Hebrew. But I just want people to know the complexity of this book with Appendix B in your second book. You've got 40 pages, 164 notes on translation concepts, I guess, in the new translation that you put there.
Mhm.
And so that's really significant, I thought, because it's such a unique book to be able to read through. And it's really set apart from, even the other poetical literature of
Yeah.
the Old Testament. It really is. And that lends to the difficulty of trying to understand the meaning, even of the terms.
Right. Yeah, there, like you said earlier, there's a lot of words that are only used once or twice, or maybe not at all, and you have to go to, corresponding languages that are related languages
Right.
to the meaning of it.
Mm.
Sometimes it'll be a technical word used, which is useful. It's maybe only used a few times, but in a few important places. For example, I'm thinking of my beloved and his desire is toward me. The word for desire is used in Genesis, where your desire will be for your husband, but he must rule over you. That thing. There's sometimes where you kind of get some interesting comparisons and contrasts, from just the fact that there are just very few usages of the word. But most times it presents more difficulty than solution. Sometimes it's a solution, but most of the time it's a difficulty. But it's not impossible. I mean, it's like digging for buried treasure. If you spend enough time with it, you can figure it out, and you know what's certain and what's not. And I think there's just beautiful lessons there that are pretty clear to draw from.
The other side of the coin of that is we just did a podcast with Michael Card. He wrote a book on Hesed.
Mhm.
That's kind of the reverse of that. You got so many different meanings.
Right.
It's difficult to figure out what exactly is going on with this word and what does it mean.
Mhm.
I know obviously the context is your guide, but it's still difficult. I have a question. You talk about the couple, Solomon and Shulamite, as being the archetype stereotypical pattern for a return to the garden paradise, where God intended man and woman to be found complete in one another.
Mhm.
Is that possible for today, or is this kind of pie in the sky kind of type thing?
Well,
Or is that out of your ballpark?
most of the questions are out of my ballpark.
What do you mean by returning to a garden paradise? What do you mean by that?
I guess I don't know which passage we're talking about in the book that we're referring to, but just thinking on the song itself,
Mhm.
I think that the very fact that it's modeling God's relationship to Israel, they are going to be restored to, to something that even surpasses or, the pre-fallen state, that you
Mhm.
can have something like a return to paradise. And there's that image, there's that imagery used, to show that the transforming effect of divine love, either between a man and woman or from God to both man and woman. But I don't know, I'm not real comfortable with self-help talk stuff about how do we achieve this,
No,
because that just gets me
we're
back.
not asking that. I don't think.
You know what I'm saying?
No.
I don't know how we do that. I think that's just back just to how we live our Christian lives. I mean, everything we know about being transformed, becoming more Christ-like, is moving towards this direction, and then that opens up.
So a man and a woman and
gospel.
a married man and a woman can reflect that image of paradise in their relationship. Obviously, it's not going to be all the time, but they can reflect it and show it to others.
Well, think of it this way. Look, couldn't we just say that the Song of Solomon is just an Old Testament version of Ephesians 5?
Yes. Yeah.
Perfect parallel. Husbands, love your wives like Christ loved the church.
Mhm.
So to the extent that the husband and wife emulate Christ's love for us, then they're reflecting all that. In the same way that if the husband and wife have the kind of love that's there, they're reflecting God's love. It's a perfect parallel. So Ephesians 5 is just shorter, but but it's the same principle, you know. And of course, it goes
I
back
don't
to
know.
Genesis. Let us create man in our own image, male and female. He created them, so that God was man plus woman, and so it was a reflection of the Trinity. You know, I think I quote Augustine too in there. He said that where there is love, there is Trinity, a lover, a beloved, and a spirit of love. And so that's in Genesis 1. Then they have Song of Solomon. God's love for us becomes a pattern for in the marriage relationship, and then in the New Testament, the same. So you have consistency throughout, you know. Right.
Well, I'm looking at the going back to the garden here, and I think it's very succinct here as God presents Eve to Adam, and he responds, "Whoa, this is now the bone of my bone, the flesh of my flesh. This is the one, God. Thank you." So I think that summarizes it right there.
There you go. There you go. Well, having just become the proud owner of 2 English cream-colored golden retrievers, I'm convinced that Adam did not name any golden retrievers when he was naming the animals.
How are we doing on time, Gabriel?
I think we're good.
I think you're muted, Gabe.
Yeah, he's muted.
The classic Zoom.
Ah,
Right.
Yeah, we're about an hour and 2 in. But I had
Good.
one other question. Kind of
Sure.
we've answered it before, but why is this book in the canon? Is it mainly to show the example of a great relationship, or is there another reason? Like, why is this in the canon? Because the Jews, right? They weren't allowed to read it till they were 35. What, 30, 35?
Oh, I think. Don't pay any attention to that. That's 1,000 years later. It means nothing.
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah. So why is this in the canon? Is it like in why do you think that?
Well, I think it's a little microcosm of the theology of the Old Testament.
Okay.
And it's a picture of, it's a microcosm in that it summarizes exactly what the future is going to hold. It pictures the reconciliation of Israel with God in the future.
Mm.
That's what that reconciliation is about.
Yeah.
The dance of the Maccabim. In fact, there's
Right.
words used a prophetic vision when they see them riding off after the reconciliation scene. It's like a prophetic vision.
Mm.
I think I put that in the notes
Yeah.
too. No, it would be a great loss not to have it. It's just
Yeah.
a shame. I actually, the real question is, how is it still there? Because it's been so misunderstood throughout history.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
That's the real question, you know, and it's only because God preserves his word, you know.
Yeah.
It's
Did you ever think about putting both books in one volume and republishing it?
oh no, I wouldn't do that because the first book's inaccurate.
Mm.
It has an inaccurate literary structure, or not as precise. The literary structure in the second book was very precise. You know, I found something, you guys will appreciate this as students of Hebrew, but when I lined up the chiastic structure, you know,
Right.
throughout the book, a computer would never show you this, but
Mhm.
what 2 of the verses lined up, I know this is in some of the notes and something I wrote, but unless one word matched up with the other verse, only because in the corresponding verse, the verb, it was really 2 words instead. They made 2 words out of the one. This in the first section, it was 1 word, but it meant something
Right.
entirely different when you then all of a sudden made 2 words out, and it's a perfect match. I mean, that
There you go.
you wouldn't get that unless you were reading it in Hebrew, but it just blew my mind. I mean,
Yeah.
the incredible precision. There was all kind of really subtle things like that. You know, let me jump ahead to some other narrative real quick. And I did some work in Switzerland on the temptation account, for example. And I discovered that there were, I think it's 30 or 35 differences between the temptation account in Matthew and the temptation account in Luke. And really subtle little things. You wouldn't believe, you wouldn't pay any attention to them, but because I was doing doctoral work, I had to put the microscope on. And I discovered that every single thing, small or large, in Matthew's account and in Luke's account. In Matthew's account, every single change was designed to set the temptation account against the backdrop of Israel's testing in the wilderness. Every single change in Luke was designed to set it against the backdrop of Adam's testing in paradise. And so this literature that we have the privilege of working with is incredibly precise. And never more so than in the Song of Solomon, where it's such beautiful, until you get into that with that kind of focus, you just don't see it's like, like a scientist who looks at the atom and sees this incredible precision. It's almost like the same sort of thing, but it's in literature, and so, it's very humbling. You get in there and you just realize you're in the presence of God. That's something God created. It's just amazing. Anyway.
Yeah. Mystery of God's word.
Yeah, it is. It's so beautiful.
Yeah.
The only literature that compares to it is really Shakespeare.
Wow.
I've read a lot, and I think Shakespeare really comes pretty close to the beauty in the Psalms. You've worked in, apples to apples. That is, you work with the original in both languages, of course, English and Shakespeare, and it's pretty close, but it lacks the depth. Shakespeare can be kind of tricky sometimes, and that's the main. Even when he comes close in the literature, which is a genius, I could work my entire life and never produce a single sonnet as good as what anyone that he did. I could my whole life. So he was a genius. But when you work with the scriptures, you see something, not only that incredible beauty, even more technical genius, but you have substance there too, which Shakespeare would veer off from. It's trivial things sometimes. Anyway, I'm ranting now.
I think we're out of time, Gabriel.
All right.
Yeah. So we talked about earlier, new books, websites, YouTube channel. Like, is there any resources you'd want to direct our listeners to? Because this book was awesome. Loved it. I love the conversation we had, but is there any additional resources you can point those that are listening to?
No.
No?
I can publish a little bit more in the future, but I'm not marketing it.
Oh, yeah. Craig,
I found it really helpful to look at the first book and see the growth in your thinking and understanding, not only in Hebrew, but in your life. That's what I got from it.
Yeah.
How is substantially different. The same person writing two different books. It's the way I looked at it. I don't know. I was really blown away and
I try to be transparent in both efforts. And can I tell you just a story? When I took across the highway here, when I took existentialism as a sophomore at SMU many years ago, my professor, first day of class, told the story about two men who were in a hospital, and they're watching a man go by in a gurney, talking to his priest, and saying he's lived a good life, he's ready to go, he's very, he knows this is his time. And the gurney went on down the hall, and Buddy looked at his friend. He said, "Now, that's the way to die." Well, a few minutes later, a guy comes cursing and yelling, being wheeled down in a gurney, and he's screaming and yelling, saying he's not ready to go, and is not going to put up with this, and I want another opinion. And the sound fades away as he goes on down the hall. And then the buddy turns to his buddy and goes, "Now, that's the way to die." And his friend looked, "Well, how can both of these things be the way to die?"
Yeah.
And he said, "Because both were being authentic to who they really were." Powerful argument. I never forgot it. Existentialists make a big claim that authenticity is, well, it is. But there's something that speaks to you when you're authentic. You got to be authentic, no matter where you are. So, I hope I can try to be authentic.
Well, thanks for your time, Craig. Very much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
We want to thank you so much. And we want to pray and ask the Lord to bless you.
All right, thank you.
In your future endeavors. So let's bow in prayer. Father, we thank you for Craig, and we thank you for his measured work in these two books, Lord, and how they enrich our lives. We thank you for the Song of Solomon and how misunderstood that book is, but clarity makes it all come alive for us. So we thank you for Craig and ask, Lord, that you would bless his life, blesses the work of his hand and with his sons in his work there as lawyer in Dallas. And we just thank you for his willingness to join us and to make the Song of Solomon come into more clarity for our listeners. So we thank you, Father, in Jesus' name.
Amen.
Thank you, sir.
This
God bless you.
I appreciate it.
Yep.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good luck, Gabe. Find that girl.
Thank you. Thanks. Enjoyed it. Bye.
All right, man. Thanks.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Book Podcast. If you liked what you heard and want to support us, like, follow, subscribe on any podcasting platform, on YouTube, on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter. Simply type in @HearTheBookPod, @HearTheBookPod. Thank you. See you next time.